So now let's take a look at texturing our skull and the bones and the jaw in order to make them look a little bit more like the original, which was carved from ivory. And if we come to our scene mode, we can come down and see that our skull texture is even called ivory, which was the texture as created in Cinema 4D. But when exported, that texture actually came through empty. And if you come down to the ivory default texture, it looks as if it's white in the thumbnail that pops up, but if you double click on it, you'll actually see that the texture itself is completely empty. It's transparent. So in that case, if we Control Tab back to our original, the color of our skull is actually just the diffuse color because the texture itself is actually empty. Anything you change this to, even a sort of ugly pukish green, is going to come right through and become the texture of the skull, which is not what we want. We want something that looks more organic. So let's create an appropriate texture for ivory. We can use the one that's already there, the empty one that we just saw a second ago, Control-tabbing over to it again. One interesting thing is we can change the size of this texture. We do not have to keep a texture the same size once it's applied. We can modify it freely. So let's come up here, in fact, and change it from 1024 by 1024 down to, say, 640 pixels wide and 320 pixels tall. Make sure Constrain Proportions is turned off if you're having trouble entering those two separate values. But we want 640 pixels wide and 320 tall. And click OK. Gives us a much smaller map to work with. And to this map, making sure that our black and white colors are selected. And if they aren't, you can just hit the D key to return the default black foreground and white background. Come up to the Filter menu and come down to Render, and once again choose Clouds. Should be familiar to you by now to generate a little bit of fractal noise. But then we're going to follow that up with another Render filter, Difference Clouds, which basically applies another instance of clouds but uses the blend mode difference to generate a little more detail. And then if we apply that again, you'll see that it looks even more detailed. We'll hit Command F or Control F on Windows to do that again and again and again and again until we get something that starts to look almost like bolts of lightning. One more. Yeah, that's pretty good. That's starting to look like almost like cracks, and that's kind of what I'm going for here. And once we've achieved that, come back down to our Layer menu and choose New Adjustment Layer, Gradient Map, which by default will apply the foreground to background and nothing will appear to change on screen. But if we click on that, we can change the black foreground color to something more in the range of the ivory we're looking at, which is a sort of yellowed white. So we'll choose yellow, and we'll come up to this brighter yellow, something around here. Maybe take it more towards orange, almost a tan effect. Something about there. Just eyeball it, see what looks good for you, and click OK. Click OK. And now when we Control-tab back to our image, you'll see that the skull texture of medium gray has been replaced by the brighter texture we just created. And if you drag around a little bit, you can see, in fact, that there is some detail in the skull from the new texture that we just made. That makes it look a little less smooth and plastic and a little bit more organic. Now, in addition to that, we want to add some grain to it. Ivory tends to be carved out of animal tusks or teeth, and those actually have grain. So we're going to apply a little bit of vertical grain. We're going to do that by introducing the topic of bump maps. We're going to do a very, very simple bump map in this case. We'll come down here to Bump Strength, which is set to 1, but there's no map assigned. So we're going to create a new texture for our bump map. We'll call this Grain Bump. 640 by 640 is fine, and click OK. Close down our adjustments and look for that map we just created, Grain Bump. There it is. Double click on it. And now let's apply some noise to that. Filter, Noise, Add Noise. Let's give ourselves a decent amount, something around, it's probably too much. Let's say about 30, and click OK. A quick Control-Tab back. Give it a second to update. And you can see what we've done here. We've ended up giving ourselves a very pebbled texture. If I zoom in a little bit more, add a little bit more, a very pebbled texture to our skull. Much, much more than it needs to be. It almost looks like it's made of styrofoam now. But if we Control-Tab back over once again to our noise map and come to Filter, Blur, and choose Motion Blur, make sure that it's set to 90 degrees vertical, and give it a distance of maybe 30 pixels or so to create this nice sort of soft blurred vertical grain. Click OK. Once again, Control-Tab back over, and you'll see the results. We've got a pretty subtle grain now applied to our ivory texture. So we have a little bit of yellowing, so we have some lighter areas and darker areas, but also a little bit of vertical grain that gives us a hint of an organic feel to it, which is good. It might be a little too strong, but this bump strength value cannot be set any lower than 1. It has to be an integer value. So to modify the strength of the bump, we'll need to actually affect the contrast of the map. If we Control-Tab back over to the map, it already seems pretty low contrast, but if we come down to our adjustment layers and choose levels and move our output level black about halfway across here, that'll reduce the size of our bump by about 50%. If we Control-Tab back, it's going to want to auto-save our single channel layer now as a Photoshop file. So it wants to know if we want to maximize compatibility. That's fine. Click OK. And you see the end result on screen. A more subtle grain, just a little gentle grain that improves the look of our ivory texture. Now we've done all this work and we want to apply it to a few other elements in the scene, and we don't want to have to do all of those steps for everything. So let's come up to the 3D panels flyout and choose Save Material Preset. Let's call this My Ivory. It'll go into a Materials folder, which is located inside the Application Support folder for Adobe Photoshop CS4. And click Save. And now that we've done that, we can come and apply that same material with same settings to our other elements. We can choose the texture for our jaw, for example, and come up and choose Replace Material, choose My Ivory that we just created, and click Load. After a moment, that'll be applied to the jaw. We'll do the same thing to the ivory texture on the bone layer. Replace Material, My Ivory, Load. And to the bone 2 layer, choose the texture, Replace Material, My Ivory, and Load. And now we have some nice textures with a more organic feel applied to our skull elements. I don't necessarily want to apply them to the teeth. I actually kind of like it that they look a little darker and as if they're made out of a different material. That to me actually kind of adds to the look that we're after. So this is pretty good. Let's come back up to our views and choose Default. Zoom back out again. And now it's time to work on a slightly more advanced kind of texture, the bump map, which will apply to the base and the top of our chalice.